Hi, Sarah. Welcome to the show. Thanks so much for coming on.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, thanks again. I'm really excited for this conversation. There's some very interesting things to unpack and talk about. But let's just start with the core of your work. So that growth philosophy. What was the moment or insight that birthed the framework and everything that you have going on built around that?
Yeah, so the growth philosophy is all about culture change, and I guess how we can utilize the knowledge that I've learned in some of the most challenging cultures, i.e., prisons, and how we can apply that to other contexts, both inside criminal justice but also outside of that kind of sector. So there was actually a moment in time, it was almost like a little bit of maybe of an epiphany, but there was moments that built up to it really. So I think there was something about understanding and experiencing a really poor culture that wasn't focused on growth at all, which I did when I first started working in prisons about 20 years ago. And very much that idea of how might I create a philosophy or how might I create a kind of theory or set of ideas that can really promote growth, not only for people that are living in prison or in contact with justice, but also the staff that work there, leaders. So for me, it was about universal truths that could be applied to any organisation, but ultimately could be meaningful for any human that is in contact with the justice system. So the philosophy came about when I was sitting in a prison, and it was an island prison called Bastøy, which is in Norway. It's quite famous for those that have know anything about prisons. Bastøy prison is seen as the most effective prison in the world, essentially. And I had the benefit of going there and researching it for a period of time. And I was sitting with someone convicted of some drug offences, sitting on the beach, overlooking the fjords, in a really kind of tranquil space, and very much thinking, how are we going to bring about this philosophy? And from that, thinking about the environment around us, so nature, thinking about our relationships, but also thinking about meaning and purpose, and how we cope with things that are difficult. So that's how it came about.
Yeah, really interesting. And yeah, we'll kind of unpack and talk more about Bastøy because that's very interesting to talk about. And then also, you were a senior academic before you got into like working with prisons and that reformation. What made you decide to step out of academia and then into forming a business, entrepreneurship?
Yeah, again, it all happened in a prison, so that's pretty much my life, to be honest, because I've only spent a lot of time in prison. But I was doing a project around how can we create positive environments within organisations and specifically prisons. And it was a 3-year project, and I worked in different prisons. I worked in high security prisons, medium and low, all in Norway. And we were doing some research. So I employed people that were living in the prison to be my researchers, along with staff, and we were capturing what that looked like through photos and through interviews. And on my last day, I was approached by three guys that two of which I didn't even know. They were strangers to me, but I remember talking about the value of the research and talking about what I'd learned as a kind of human, really. And they said, I don't know why I'm saying this, but all of them independently said, I know I've been told, or I know that you need to take responsibility for this learning and go and do good with it, and you need to quit your job. And one was very, very clear that this is an instruction. You need to quit your job. So I literally came home and handed in my resignation without any job, which was, yeah, relatively gutsy, maybe in hindsight, and a bit scary. And with that was just like, how am I gonna, do good with this work? How am I gonna serve people, whether that's people in prison or people in the community? And after a couple of months of thinking that through, I set up Penal Reform Solutions. So I started in September 2016, I think it was. And that was literally, within a week of making that decision and setting up and the business, I got a contract to go into a prison that was failing, to go and support them in their culture work, which looking back on it now is unheard of. So I think there was something about the universe kind of aligning and this door opening. And with that, the growth project started, which is our culture change program.
Mm. Amazing. And it's the same. Yeah, when you said that's unheard of, and it's also, those the three people that approached you and told you you have to go into that. You can kind of look at that as like divine intervention, the universe had a real purpose and drive for your mission. So yeah, very, very cool, very interesting. And I'm all for like woo-woo conversations as well. So yeah, I kind of like to go down that route weirdly sometimes. But yeah, most people also associate prisons with punishment, not growth. What was the mindset shift that you had to make and help others make to begin that, transforming that narrative?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the thing is, there's something about what is punishment. And looking at it from an academic point of view, rehabilitation is a form of punishment in the sense of it's a way in which we can respond to crime, right? But I think there's something about effectiveness. So what is the most effective way in which we punish? In order to promote the community, in order for communities to feel safe, in order for future victims not to take place, essentially. And from my experience, and I guess the Norwegian stuff really influenced this, they very much talk about who do you want to be your neighbour? Do you want your neighbour to be mentally unwell, institutionalised, struggle with alcohol, not dealt their trauma, not dealt with the reasons why they've committed their offending, and that be your neighbour? Or do you want someone who's rehabilitated, who's a good citizen, who's a hero, who helps you with your getting your bins out, whatever it may be? And growth enables you to do that. And I think the more I spend with people who have been in prison or in contact with the criminal justice system, what we know is the majority of them have had some kind of childhood trauma. Majority that is unresolved in some kind of way. But there are reasons why people commit crime. And I think the thing about growth is it takes away the outcome is harm, which none of us want. And we, completely condone that. For me, there's something about what happened, what got you to the point where you felt you had to hurt somebody. And if we can understand that, and we can understand what that individual was maybe trying to achieve, which is generally respect, acceptance, expressing loyalty, a sense of belonging. If we think about gang membership, if we think about all these are good values, but they're just being dealt with in really bad ways. And so for me, there's something about, let's just think about the person. Let's think about what they've been through. Let's think about their context. And with that, let's build their strengths. Let's get them to think about what do you want to do in the world? What skills do you have? How can you contribute to the community? That conversation is so much more strengths-based than what we know research tells us is that if we shame people and we make them feel bad and we give them loads of labels, offender, criminal, whatever it may be, they're more likely to commit a crime. So I think there's something about they've got a responsibility to work on their lives. We've got a responsibility to create an environment where they feel safe enough to talk about some of the stuff that's really vulnerable for them to talk about. And I think if we can do that, we're going to have good neighbours. So that's what growth's all about. It's about how can we support those that commit offending in order so that we don't get future victims. So it's logic. It makes sense logically, doesn't it? Of course. But the problem with crime is it's really personal and it's really emotive. And that's the challenge, that we want to be punitive and we want them to hurt because we're hurt and we feel it when we are, having been victim of crime as well. I felt it. I felt that need to be vengeful and get someone to really feel how I felt for that moment in time. The problem is that consistently being has shown to not work. And even when, there's some really interesting research around death row and around the death penalty. And even when people have watched their perpetrator be killed in front of them, they still don't feel what they thought they'd feel. I'm going to now feel justice. I'm now going to feel peace. But we can get that when we do restorative justice. We can get that through dialogue and repair and understanding. That's a lot more likely if we focus on rehabilitation. But it's that emotion that makes it really tricky.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. It's kind of interesting. So I kind of live by David Hawkins' map of consciousness, which I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's the levels of, the energies or emotions that you can feel at any moment of time, but also like your base state of emotion. And I just keep thinking about this whilst you're talking, because it is those different levels. And, like the fear-based emotions are that, wanting revenge and shame and grief and all those, lower emotions that every human feels. And you mentioned that the childhood trauma. And I was on a podcast yesterday with a coach who trains and coaches high performing CEOs, and he said exactly the same about so many of them suffer from childhood trauma, and they have this need to prove themselves. So it's kind of like the other side of, high performing, but in a fear-based way where they're trying to prove something to their parents or whatever. It's kind of crazy. So it does shows up in different ways, but I'm right there with you when it comes to, that the higher levels of consciousness ultimately. And that I believe growth externally is an internal journey throughout anybody, and prisons and people that, are in prisons are, it's an extreme, like, personal growth journey, I guess, that you're kind of dealing with.
Yeah, and I think there's something about just having the space to think about it. I mean, it is really, I don't think we do an awful lot in terms of intervention. I mean, our intervention is cultural change. So we work within the culture and the organisation, but so people get recruited to the culture work we do through the Growth Project, who are people in prison. And we do some small interventions with them about, what gives you meaning? What do you want to say to the world? What do you want the world to hear from you? Really simple, growth orientated questions, but not a massive amount, not loads of money, not like an intensive 6-year therapy process. Do you know what I mean? But what's really interesting is the minute they get it, the minute they land it in terms of this is what I want to be, it creates something that's a new energy about, right, okay, how am I going to go about doing that? And what are the things I need to do? And I think that's the thing, we offer lifelong unconditional membership. So people can ring up no matter when, whether they've just relapsed from drugs, whether they've just offended, they can ring up and that we will always be there for them, irrespective. And that's really rare, isn't it? Because when people generally commit crime, they're rejected, they're sent to prison, or they're called, to prison if they've committed an offence in the community, or their parents kick them out, or their school kicks them out. It's all about that rejection constantly. And I think for me, growth is about, we sit with it. What have you learned? What do you need to learn moving forward? How can we do that with a growth mindset at heart? And I've met some incredible people that are now, David Hayes is doing his 10th world record for mental health. And I met him in prison, and he's a paddleboarder that goes around the world as an adventurer. Or Cam Stevens, who's a director of films, or Noel, who's a trainer with awards. It's all these people that they got what was their spark, and the whole thing shifts. And we don't invest enough in the growth of people. We just constantly talk to them about their offending, which has a purpose, of course. But you kind of think, if we thought about the worst thing we've ever done, and someone just constantly every 16 weeks talking to us about it, it isn't necessarily going to motivate us, like there's so much else going on in our world, isn't there, than that one thing that we're so shameful of talking about or working through. And yet that defines people in prison. And that's the difficulty, is the damage that the system does, on top of the damage that's already been caused. That's the problem.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's the identity, isn't it? It's like the identity of being a convict and a prisoner. And you're told that over and over I'm speaking totally from ignorance because I don't have any experience of this, but I can just imagine that it creates that, identity, and then labels are thrown around. And it's really interesting. How do you define a growth culture in the context of prison then, and how do you measure it? Or is it possible? Do you have certain measuring capabilities? I don't know.
Yeah, we do. We measure it. So what we tend to do as a process is going in and doing essentially an assessment on what the culture is. And for me, there's something about talking to a range of people. So we generally take a kind of wholesome systems approach. So like any organisation, you've got loads of different roles, loads of different ranks. And for us, of course, we've got people in prison. So there's something about just sitting with them, building a relationship. So my PhD was all around relationships and how we can kind of magnify the power of those. But building trust, I guess, initially, so that people are actually going to tell us the reality. Because as we know, in real life, like when you don't trust someone, you're not going to tell them what the real problems are, really. So we spend quite a lot of time building trust. But once we've done that, it's talking about things like hope. How hopeful are you? What are your relationships like here? amongst together, either between people or between different groups of people. What does leadership look like here? So real kind of cultural markers, which is quite a systematic kind of review that we kind of do. And we do that at the beginning of a project and then we do that at the end, in terms of really understanding what's happening along the way and how we measure not only harm reduction, ideally, but also success. So, we measure how many staff, how many staff stay in the job. What we know is significant amount of people leave after 3 months of being in a prison, mainly because it's quite violent, a lot of the time. We measure, how many people stay, why do they stay, what are the reasons for that, as well as things like self-harm reducing. So in our projects, we've generally found about 70 to 80% of reduction in self-harm, in terms of violence against staff, violence against each other in terms of the people in prison. So it's all very much kind of mapped out, and that enables us to get that feedback to really understand what that culture is. But ultimately, a growth culture is like a growth culture would be for me and you if we were to be rehabilitating from a leg injury or a mental health issue. It's very much about creating an environment where people can feel safe, where people can trust each other, where people have hope, essentially, where people can find meaning in the work that they're doing, but also how they can build those skills. We need people to have the skills. Part of our growth philosophy is people do the best with the resources they have. So invariably, when people come into prison, they are lacking resource, whether that's over 70% of people are neurodiverse in prison. So stuff like communication is really challenging sometimes, for example, for some of those individuals. Then you put that in conjunction with the fact that we then have a lot of people from very poor backgrounds, low education. So if you're 10 times more likely to go to prison if you've been excluded from school, for example, and the more schools you're excluded from, the more likely you are to get on that pipeline to prison. So there's something about building resources, but people feeling that they are able to build, they have opportunities to be trusted or to have those, to have that kind of resource given to them so they can be better people, essentially. But I would say that the crux of growth is the orientation of it. So instead of me sitting opposite you going, you've got to change, you're bad, you're wrong, you're evil, whatever, it's standing alongside someone and saying, I absolutely believe you can do this. Let's think about what you need. And that's the difference. I think there's something about, let's find out what you want to do between us. And we both kind of know that kind of crime doesn't serve you, like irrespective of how much money people get or how much they say, yeah, I'll go back and it's everything I want. When you think about things like peace, does it give you peace? No, it doesn't. It may give me a load of money, but it doesn't make me happy or connected. Invariably makes me feel pretty lonely and pretty hurt. So it's getting to the bottom of it, all this noise that happens along the way. It's getting to the bottom of it and saying, who do you want to be? Who, when someone says your obituary at the end of your life, how do you want to be known? Like, do you want to be known as someone who steals stuff from shops, who had addiction issues all your life? Or do you want to be known as someone who was brave enough to think about recovery? That's the stuff we talk about.
You mentioned 6 conditions for transformative change. Could you walk us through those and how they apply?
Yeah, sure. So this is, and I believe these can apply to any organisations. I really do. I think there's something about understanding if we are going to create transformative change in our organisation. And a lot of the time, like you say, there's lots of different organisations that have got toxic cultures that don't support people's well-being, that don't allow individuals to have permission to be self-compassionate, for example. So these conditions for me are, what's the process by which we can help that change process? And the first one is about understanding the context. So understanding what's the history of the place. And that's not about, when the business was created, but ultimately, have there been challenges along the way? A lot of the time people carry trauma. And if things happen within organizations, so if there's lots of harassment or if there's lots of bullying or if it's a kind of dog-eat-dog culture, people carry fear. And so understanding that culture is really important to kind of get to the bottom of what people need, which is really important, I guess, in terms of those conditions. So this firstly is about understanding the context of the organization, of the culture, of the people within that culture. There's then exactly what you were talking about in terms of identity. So identity and relationships being the key. not only in terms of what are our relationships with leadership or on the ground, but what is the identity of the organisation? How do we see it from the outside? How do we see it from the inside? A lot of the time within prisons, they are literally assessed as broken, violent, unhealthy, toxic. That's what litters the inspection reports that we get from prison. So you're going to, in exactly the same way that someone who offends is going to internalize that stuff, you're going to internalize it. So there's something about understanding the identity of an organization and what it wants to be. For me, there's something about post-traumatic growth, which is very much, it kind of came from the post-traumatic stress disorder work around veterans. But ultimately, it's like when things go wrong and when there's adversity and when there's suffering and trauma, how can we take strength from it? And we can, I think, when we look back on all the things that we've gone through as people and adversity that we've experienced, we can take suddenly the things we value more, or suddenly the things we've learned about relationships, or suddenly we've realized that there's a new path in which we maybe need to walk down that's going to serve us better. And that's what we do within that change process. It's about saying, what are the skills within this organization? What are the strengths of it? And how can we learn from the mistakes that it's made? So it's not shaming. It's about moving forward. It's about recognizing the harm, but reconciling that and restoring that and repairing that. And there's something, I guess, the fourth condition is then about including everyone. And that includes, of course, people in prison. It includes our staff that show up every day. It includes the families of our staff or the families of those that are in prison, leaders. But for me, there's something about, with diversity brings some brilliant solutions. Yeah. Long-term sustainable solutions come when you have a lot of diversity in the room. And in prison, that's exactly what we have. So we very much think about what is the whole system, what is that ecosystem that we are creating. We've got a little community embedded within our community within prisons. So how can we represent that? How can we listen from different people? Even, like going to talk to the cleaner at lunch breaks, I'd go and say, what do you see in conversations, and how hopeful do people talk? And all of that kind of stuff is great information that's going to help us understand an environment in terms of how people are treated, particularly those that are of a lower rank, or particularly those that are incarcerated, essentially. I guess the last two are maybe the conditions that are really important, which is around this prevention, which I guess I've already talked about. So preventing harm, very much thinking about what happened to an individual, what were the root causes of it once it's happened, but us really thinking about, okay, so we know these things already. I know that if we build a sense of belonging, if we build a sense of trust, if we build resources in an individual so they can cope with the world around them, then I know that they're less likely to go to prison. And we do schools work that enable people at risk, kids at a risk of exclusion. That's what we do. And we have people that have been in prison that co-facilitate that to really help them navigate where they're at and why they're at risk of exclusion. But that prevention work is hopefully reducing the likelihood of that person walking down that path to crime, because the minute they hit prison, they're going to experience a load of other trauma. Yeah. If you're thinking, every 30 seconds someone's self-harming in a prison at the minute, people watch that. People watch people die in prison, or walk into a cell and see someone hanging. They watch that stuff. So it is a pot of trauma in its own right, really. So for us, there's something about, we don't want people to get to prison. We want to support people in the community. We want people to support them in schools. And then I guess that informs the last condition, which is all about sustainability. This is about long game. We're not in this for short-term outcomes. We know that it takes at least 12 months before we start seeing any reduction in harm in a prison, because it's like planting a seed, isn't it? You plant a seed and you don't expect a tree the next day, which I think politically we do, and maybe from a public point of view we sometimes do, and say, well, we've invested in this seed. Where's the fruit? And you just think it's going to take a lot of not only planting, but you've got to create the conditions where it can grow. And I think that's the challenge, that we're in really toxic conditions. The earth is poisoned. There's no sun. Sometimes literally there's no sun, with no, cells with no windows. So how are we going to do that? And that's why it takes a bit of time, but investing in the long game is going to serve us better. That's the key, I think.
Yeah. And do you, because man, it must be, a challenging, emotionally up and down situation that you're in, trying to do the work that you do you, you say like investing in the long term, do you kind of see the, over your journey so far, do you see the differences? And yeah.
I
Yeah.
do. I do see the differences. The thing is, I've always been incredibly impatient, probably. So I say that it's really important to be patient and think of the long game, but I really want things to happen really quickly. And I think the difficulty is when you see the collateral damage of prison and the damage that it causes people, and I include staff in that, it creates an urgency, doesn't it? It's a bit like a war. Suddenly, when you're in a war, you suddenly realise there's a lot of urgency. You need to do something quickly, kind of thing. So I do have that real. For a very long period of time, I was always in a rush. Like I've got to do it. I've got to work harder. I've got to work longer hours. I've got to see more prisons, or I've got to speak to more people to try and to get into prison. So there is that underlying urgency that I have to kind of check myself with quite regularly in terms of is it engulfing you? Because when you're in a prison for a long period of time, it can literally kind of suck you in like a black hole. And then suddenly you're starting to normalize, I'm just seeing people get hurt, or I'm seeing blood everywhere. And that's just every day. That's not, you don't feel anything anymore. So I think there's something really important that if you're ever in this line of work, or even just appreciating the people that are in this line of work, that there's a lot of that. There's a lot of moral injury, I guess, and there's a lot of desensitization that happens. And we need to invest in ourselves and be self-compassionate in order to keep going, really, because I see a load of people burn out, good people that have got a good heart, that want to make a difference, particularly people that have been in prison. They go back into prison to support people. That's a big thing at the minute. We've got a lot of our lived experience community having been in the system and walked in those shoes. Are they going back in, working with, working in prisons, working in probation, working with people who offend, to give back and to support them? But that leaves us really vulnerable to burnout, because it's really emotional. This work is really emotional, like a lot of the time, particularly when, people that you care an awful lot about take their life, or relapse from drugs, or reoffend, or go back to prison, or and you're talking to their mum on the phone and saying, she's like, what am I going to do? He's just gone back. And it's a really difficult, I've had to ring people up and tell people that their best friends have taken their life. That's tough stuff. So yeah, it is an emotional roller coaster, of joy as well. I think that's the other thing. It can be so joyful, and it can be so, you wouldn't imagine that in prison. People just think these terrible places with terrible people, but there is so much kind of humanity there, like in terms of, I've always been treated with so much kindness and respect. I mean, I'm kind of there to support them, so I guess that's that, they know my position, but I feel incredibly protected in that sense. And with that, people have been incredibly kind, when they really have nothing to give, and yet they still do. So it's a privilege to work in these environments, even though they are incredibly hard. Yeah.
Yeah. It's I was talking to my brother yesterday in between, us having that intro call and this podcast about about me shooting a podcast with you, and you do prison work, and he was talking about one time when, so his girlfriend many years ago, like 10 years ago or longer, she was in like doing a drama. I think she was at uni, like doing drama, and one of her projects was to go into prison and like sort of coordinate a play, and it was quite a sensitive subject, the whole play that it was around, and he was just unbelievably taken aback because he went in there to visit, and so like the work that she was doing with this play, and he said the prisoners that she was working with were, some of them were like in prison for some like serious crimes, and he said he couldn't believe what they were like. They were just really involved in all these like like crazy drama, like rehearsals and stuff. And he went in and he like said they were very protective of her with, if somebody was just any kind of like form of being rude or anything like that, they ended up being really protective of her. And he just couldn't believe it, really welcoming with him and the whole atmosphere in that just situation and that project. He said he was just really taken aback about the environment and what they were like. So, yeah, he was telling me that story yesterday.
Yeah. And I absolutely don't doubt it, because I mean, I think all my family have now been in prison. I mean, even when I went at Bastøy, they opened their prison up to the public once a year, and I'd done the research there. And my kids at that time were two, maybe 4 and 6, I think 4 and 6. And I took them in there to meet the researchers and spend the day. And I said, oh, stay close, because obviously you would do that as a mum, just generally stay close. But we're going to go into a prison, and there's going to be people in here that obviously are in prison. And they met all these guys, and I just remember my son in his cute little voice, he's 18 now, but in his cute little voice on the way back, I said, what did you think about the prison? And he said, where were the prisoners? Where were they? And I said, well, you were playing basketball with them, and they were the ones that gave you the food. And I said, all of the people you met today were prisoners. And they were like, what, like bad prisoners? Like, did they do bad things? And I said, well, yeah, they did some stuff. The only other one was we did a play. So Cam Stevens, who works with me now as a senior consultant, he designed a screenplay about spice use in prisons. And we invited the community, but I invited my husband, and I invited my dad. And it was just really funny, because a guy who used to work with us, who's sadly no longer, but he was in the play, and he was desperate to meet my dad, desperate. And I just remember he got to the end of the day, and all the visitors were going out of the prison, and they were all going back to the wings and going back to their rooms. And Nicky was just like, hang on, I have a message, Sarah's dad. And he kind of put his hand up, and he's like, Ian, and he's shouting at my dad, and my dad's turning around going, what the hell is happening? This guy's running to him like break like Moses, with, like, get out of the way, I want to go and see Ian. And he hugged him, like proper hugged him. He was like, I love your daughter, she's so good in here, and she's supporting us. And my dad was just like, what is happening?
Yeah.
Amazing. And then you obviously, this is a guy who was in for murder, but there was so much about him that made him such a kind human. So yeah, it happens all the time. It happens every day. Good things.
Yeah, amazing. Tell me more about Bastøy then, as the model, because you've mentioned that a few times. Like, what is it that makes that ultimately different, and a prison 2 model, if that is what you think it is, or not? I'm not sure.
Yeah, great question. The thing about Bastøy is, I think for me, it's about the contrast. So I worked for probation for a time, and I obviously, as I told you, I worked in prisons. And I genuinely didn't think that prisons could be rehabilitative. I just thought they are a place of punishment. Yeah, they are a place of retribution and being punitive and hurt and all that kind of jazz. And I think there's something about, I remember the first time I stepped on, so with Bastøy, you have to get a ferry across the water. And the guy who drives that ferry is someone who lives there. So automatically you're kind of putting your life in the hands of someone who lives in prison. So that in itself is relatively symbolic, I guess. But the minute you step into it, or onto it even, as an island, you don't see a prison. So if you could just imagine essentially an island that's got a village in it with a church, you see a shop, you see a school, you see buildings, you see little lodges which are dotted around. And if you can imagine the kind of Norwegian like forest essentially around that, and a kind of bird sanctuary on the east of the island, you've got this really tranquil, quiet environment. And we basically were like, what are the ingredients of it? Why does this work? And the main things is stuff around meaningful relationships with each other and the staff, meaningful work. So people genuinely getting a degree, or, learning something they never learned before, doing therapy in terms of what they were, responsibility training is what they talk about at Bastøy. Yeah? So they're training people to be responsible. They're not saying we're going to lock you behind the door for 23 hours a day, which is what we tend to do. I'm going to tell you when to go to the toilet. I'm going to tell you when you can see your family. I can tell you when to shower. I'm going to tell you when to eat. And that's the opposite of Bastøy. Bastøy is like, you need to be a citizen on this island. You need to work. You need to earn money. You need to buy your food. You need to cook your food. You need to organise your time out of the prison if you're seeing family. And so it's all about, we are preparing you for release, quite literally. So it's very normal. You can't see, sometimes I would talk to someone, I thought they were a member of staff. They weren't. They were, because they don't wear uniforms sometimes. You don't know who's who really, because it is just such a normal environment. And I think the beauty of that is that the minute you see normality or feel normality, you suddenly just kind of look for that. So you just have normal conversations, whereas in prisons, you don't necessarily have that in the same kind of way because you're in a really abnormal environment with abnormal people, quote unquote, you know. So there was something about nature. There was something about, you know, there's a beautiful picture that I took of a guy who was feeding this tame fox who used to go into their houses and steal their shoes. And they used to feed this fox. It was the fattest fox I've ever seen. I grew up in London, so I've seen some pretty rubbish foxes, but this was a fatty, a proper fatty fox. And I was just like, and he just said to me, he said, even the slyest of creatures can be tamed here. And I just kind of thought, that is it. It's like you just can go there and suddenly there's peace. And that peace allows people to really reflect on the harm they've caused, who they want to be. You know, taking away someone's liberties is hard. You know, we know that from COVID when we had to get locked down. Yeah, we were like, this is awful, right? So I think we underestimate how punishing losing your freedom is. But in that space, it enables people to really think about who they are. And that's why it has the lowest rate of reoffending. You know, people say this is a holiday camp, you know, like people just want to come back here. Well, people don't, you know, statistically, it is the least prison where people go back. And yet in America or in you know, some places in our country and abroad, of course, you've got really, really challenging environments that are tough on crime and punitive. And 80% of people go back. You know, you just think they have got it. Norway have got the answer. They don't apply it necessarily to all the prisons, but Bastøy is a place where I grew. You know, it wasn't just like people in prison or on a sentence grows. You go there and you grow because you suddenly, everything stops, you know, no phones. You just stop and you think and you reflect. It's, you know, it's like a retreat, I guess, in that kind of way. But that humanity you can feel in the air. You can feel that respect and that trust. And it's kind of almost thick in the same kind of way that when I walk into a bubbly wing that's pretty violent, it's kind of thick with tension and everything's a bit, oh, it's going to kick off. You know, it's exactly the same, but the opposite. And that's going to have a massive impact on how we communicate and how we talk. So yeah, big fan, as you can tell.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. That sounds, there's a lot of things that make sense about that. I mean, it's all about rehabilitation and reintroducing prisoners into public society, into society. So like, why would you not reform in that, use that model rather than, it being completely the opposite, like in prisons when you are just locked down, told what to do, have all your freedoms taken away. And man, I struggled during that time in the pandemic, like, because my top driving value is like growth and freedom, and having those freedoms taken away during the pandemic was not. I've got some kind of controversial opinions and stuff around that, but that's definitely for another podcast.
But yeah, freedom's so important, isn't it? It's important for all of us. So important to feel heard and feel seen. And a lot of people, I think, commit crime in order to feel that freedom, but they're feeling it in ways that, you know, that aren't conducive to actually getting it. Do you know what I mean? So it is so punishing to see people lose their freedom. And I think that's the grip of the system, you know, that really oppressive feeling. You know, we all feel that in little ways, but certainly I learned a lot from the guys in prison during COVID because I was lucky enough to still be going into prisons at the time, and they're used to lockdown, right? So you know, you kind of think they're just like, well, this is what I kind of do. You know, I kind of create my own routine, and you kind of think all of these guys are set up for lockdown a lot more than we are. You know, because we're just so used to taking for granted our freedom and saying we can do what we want or, you know, where we want really. So yeah. I learned a lot. A lot.
You're developing a growth app. So, you know, moving into the technology development world. And that's ultimately to shift, you know, to have a bigger impact in shifting public narrative. How do you balance, like, you know, your mission with innovation, like getting out there doing media visibility while staying true to the core of that, you know, your mission? And how do you balance everything that you do?
I don't. I don't balance it, James. I read that question and was like, oh, I'm going to be honest, really. I don't balance it at all well, really. I think it's the things that get compromised, isn't it, along the way? Yeah. So really big, strong mission. We want to change culture globally across the criminal justice system. Well, that's a big mission. The app is, we've moved from doing a proof of concept. Does this stuff work? That I'm kind of, these ideas, these philosophies, do they actually work? We found out that absolutely they do work. And now with confidence, we're scaling. That's basically our kind of business model. So the growth app is all about, we're creating an online ecosystem, but ultimately a kind of marketplace or a kind of TripAdvisor kind of space where people can go and grow, whether you're a person from prison, whether you're an ex-veteran, whatever. So the app is really important in terms of, I guess, scalability. What I've learned pretty quick was that I wasn't ever gonna, there's a dude called John Howard who's like a prison reform man. He went on a horse and he used to just travel around on a horse, obviously a very long time ago, to do prison reform, essentially. I'm not going to get round. There's too many prisons out there. There's too much harm going down. So we got to scale it. And so for me, there's something about us looking at our kind of franchise model, but also looking at Justice 2.0, which is our kind of campaign, and the app. All of these things are about how do we scale it up so that we can serve more people quicker, essentially. The difficulty with that is is consuming. And I think over my career, it certainly has consumed me to the point I imagine has contributed to a deterioration of my health. I've got a slight paralysis down my right side. So I've got hemiplegia from a doctor who was negligent. So there's the victim story, I guess. But also I've got fibromyalgia, which is pretty much a symptom of burnout, I imagine, reflecting on that. So every day I'm kind of reminded of the lack of balance, but I have over the last year certainly trying very hard to manage pain better, to manage my life better, to try and rest up a bit. The problem I have on a very kind of honest level is that I'm really struggle to know how to relax, because it is always there. And it's almost like this reform movement is like an addiction in some ways, in healthy ways, but also in unhealthy ways, like addiction is. So yeah, I find myself in recovery sometimes, I guess, in terms of being able to strike that balance really well. But a lot of the time, and I wonder whether there's other people out there, other CEOs that have got big missions and big plans and big dreams, I imagine they feel the same sometimes. But yeah, that's probably where I'm at the minute. Still haven't quite worked it out, but I'm working on it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, I talk about burnout through, business growth and that kind of thing. And that is rife, but it's also just the nature of your work is just, it's an extreme level. So, I'm not talking about, I might have too many sales meetings and client work to do in my calendar, and I've got all these expectations, but that's nothing compared to like what you're actually doing when it comes to, serious, impactful work that has so much emotional turmoil around it. And that's a whole different level that, yeah, I can't even begin to imagine. So yeah, crazy.
Yeah. I mean, I have an incredible system around me that helps massively. I mean, my husband, we've been together 27 years, so I pretty much met him out of the womb, pretty much, like I'm absolutely so in love with him in terms of he is my best friend, but he also is massive help. He enables me to do the work that I do. I'm away every month internationally doing stuff in the Middle East or in Asia or in Europe with culture work, and he allows that, not allows that, but he allows it to be possible, I guess, because of his support for him being in the fan club, really. But we also have an amazing team around us. We've got people that have been in prison that work for us, but former probation and prison officers as well. And we are really focused. I mean, yesterday all day we just talked about trauma, vicarious trauma from our work, and how we can stay strong and create a sense of belonging in our team. And we spent a whole day reflecting on what are our relationships like, how are we feeling, are you okay, what's been difficult. We dedicate a lot of time to well-being, because burning out is then going to completely wreck everything. I mean, that's the answer, isn't it? Like if I do burn out, then I won't do it. I won't achieve what I want to achieve. we structure it very much within a work capacity. It's really good. I think it's probably more my personal stuff that's probably harder, like at weekends and evenings. I've got a lot better, but yeah, it's the stuff that comes back to you a lot. There's a lot of harm going on there, and going into the most challenging environments is obviously, like you say, you see a lot and you hear a lot and you feel a lot and you smell a lot. So yeah, even little things, like, funny things, hospitals, suddenly I'm back in prison, or suddenly if you go into a greasy spoon, that kind of grease smell, I'm back in prison, or you hear a key, I'm back in prison. So it's just that it does take its toll if you're not careful, if you're not aware.
Yeah, for sure. And tell me just a little bit about then. So obviously, because you mentioned, like, those different energies that you feel, and I totally get that. You feel different energies when you're in different environments that you might feel, oh, it's going to kick off, like this isn't safe. You're in an environment and you can feel that sometimes, say just walking through a dodgy street in London or whatever. It's just, you just get this vibe, and then other places you just feel, yeah, everything's great and safe, and it's just an energy, because I believe we're just more than our physical being, right? We do have this energetic aura, and we can all intuitively feel these things on a non-physical level. But you mentioned that, and you also mentioned previous to me about the whole narrative, like the mainstream narrative around prisons, and you mentioned like the big thing in big series that came out on Netflix like a few weeks ago, and you were like, that's this public push narrative around prisons that's not really a true depiction, and there is this public narrative around prisons that just isn't a true depiction. What are kind of the main things? What are the main things that aren't true in public narrative?
I think there's something about the way in which they're constructed. So in some senses, that tension is built, and absolutely you feel that. I feel that tension that sometimes it gets kind of demonstrated on documentaries. For me, it's just a very small part of prison, though. So you've got a small percentage of the prison population that are violent, difficult, complex needs, self-harming. You've got people where harm is distributed, but a lot of the time you've got all of those other individuals where that isn't the case, and I think that there's something for me about the bigger picture of stuff that you don't seeing a bit more, I guess, and that's what we're pushing with the campaign, the success stories, or that, when people have worked hard on their rehabilitation and now they're setting up charities as CEOs, and they're working really hard and they're making a difference, all of this kind of stuff, this kind of this hopeful stuff and this good stuff that happens, that doesn't get depicted. And the reason for that is that people want, I guess, it to look like a deterrent, right? You don't want to be, look how amazing this amazing place is where you can go and reform your life. I think maybe that's the reason why they do it. But I think there's something for me about, we've talked a lot with, media outlets, Channel 4 and the like, about doing a documentary about saying, look, we are turning prisons around from this place of really kind of can be quite violent, and with the help of the staff and the people that are living there, we can turn it into an environment that serves the public. And they're just like, well, what about the violence? Can we frame it in a way that makes it really kind of glamorized, and that isn't a true depiction of what people are like in prison.
Yeah.
And the everyday stuff of prison. And there's moments of it that are really quite lovely. Just recently spoken to someone who said that on their wing, so that's about, say, 60 men on that wing, every week they get a thank you card. So every week someone in prison writes a thank you card to those staff saying how grateful they are for the help that they get. And I just think we don't hear about that. We don't hear about the kind of good work that all our officers are doing. Every time there's corruption or there's some kind of inappropriate relationship or OnlyFans scam, whatever it may be, we hear that all the time. But we don't get the other side of prison that kind of highlights how hard it is for staff and for the people in it. But also the beauty of it and the talent that's in there. Like so many people I've met are now CEOs of organisations. Their entrepreneurs are packed full in our prisons, because if you think, what are the skills I mean, what are the skills you need to deal drugs, right? You need logistics, you need relationships, you need to know how to compromise, negotiate, money, deliveries, all of these things. You need those skills in order to be good at it, right? So if they just diverted those skills into something like a business, you're unlocking a load of potential in people that maybe have only thought this is the life I've got to lead, but the sad thing is we know that life either leads to prison or death. I mean, that's what we know. So yeah, it's just about the other side of it, I think, is missing for me.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I mean, there's that Hollywoodified, dramatized, hooking people into selling the fear side, just gets people engrossed, and you see that in media as well. Just even mainstream media, like I totally tuned out because it's just it triggers that amygdala, like lizard brain, like survival. So yeah, for sure. Where can listeners find out more about your work? Learning about more about your growth approach.
Yeah. I mean, there's loads. I'm on LinkedIn, so I'm on there, all the time, really. So search me up. I'm there on our website. So Penal Reform Solutions, www.penalreformsolutions.com. You'll see some stuff there in terms of our services, our culture work. We've just launched some online courses for people working within criminal justice. Really bite-sized, very focused on our kind of Gen Zs, trying to create new kind of culture carriers in the system. So that's all through our community interest company. So that's the other organisation that I'm the director of. And you'll find all information around Grow Transform Belong, which you can, we're on Instagram, TikTok and LinkedIn. So yeah. And then in terms of our campaign, we have a YouTube channel called Justice 2.0. So that's where all of our stuff around building public awareness, building bridges, building connections, raising awareness around prisons, all of that kind of stuff is starting to get banked. So yeah, trying to be a lot more outward focusing. But ultimately, anyone who wants to get in touch, email us info@penalreformsolutions.com. Happy to hear from you.
Amazing. Well, I'll make sure I put the links in the description as well. And I really appreciate this conversation, Sarah. It's like super interesting, different avenue to discover or explore around growth. And yeah, a lot of what you say makes sense. So I really appreciate your insights in this conversation, and I'll be watching your journey and growth with great interest.
Lovely. Thanks so much. Thanks for inviting me, James. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks a lot.